Wherever you might find yourself across reality, whether in our own world or some other universe, time is going to be a precious resource. Maybe the most precious resource. And it doesn't matter if you're only managing your own life or running an organization made up of billions. One of the most important questions you need to be able to answer is, how long does it take to get to X from Y? If Minas Tirith is under siege, how long will it take to assemble the Rohirrim and then ride to war? If your starship is catapulted into the Delta Quadrant and you're trying to get back home, will you even live long enough to see your family again? If you want a cornetto from the local shop, how much of your day is that going to take up? You might not have a precise answer in these cases, but at the very least, you can make a rough guess.
3 days ride, as the Nazgul flies. And you better hope we don't have one of those on our tail.
Even at maximum speeds, it would take 75 years to reach the Federation.
But now let me ask you what should be a simple question. How long does it take to get from Tatooine, a remote world in the Outer Rim territories, to Coruscant, the political heart of the galaxy? I don't have an answer for this. I don't even have a reasonable guess. Sometimes a hyperspace journey like this seems to take days, weeks, or even months, while other times it's almost instantaneous. And while it might be tempting to dismiss this as something that doesn't really matter or is just a bit of trivia, time is still a precious resource in this galaxy and every other. The answer of how long it takes to get to X from Y isn't some minor detail, but will always be a fundamental pillar of civilization. It affects everything. As an example, let's go a bit broader and look at how the speed of hyperspace travel between the core worlds and the Outer Rim might change the entire nature of the galaxy. If travel times are longer, then the Outer Rim starts to look like this. There might be a limited government presence, challenges in the enforcement of laws, reduced accessibility of services, limited infrastructure, economic isolation, cultural isolation/preservation, a unique identity, and in general, the Outer Rim will be slower to adopt new ideas, technology, and galactic trends. And this list is by no means complete. The impact of even one of these elements can be far-reaching. A limited governmental presence, for example, can lead to feelings of neglect and marginalization, embolden criminal elements, empower more informal types of governments based on existing power structures, and a multitude of other developments whose effects might only become apparent in hindsight. But if travel times are shorter, then you generally expect the Outer Rim to look quite a bit different. When distance is less of a barrier, the distinction between the core and the Outer Rim becomes less pronounced. Whether a planet becomes a fully developed world, or a remote backwater, is determined by other factors, resources, government policy, or various other local elements. But the relationship between the Outer Rim and the core is still only one aspect among countless others that is deeply affected by travel times. Time management, scheduling, commuting, productivity, planning, decision-making, resource allocation, cost control, risk management, communications, accountability, coordination, security, logistics, these are all things heavily dependent on that one question. How long does it take to get to X from Y? But when there's no answer to that question, or the answer seems to fluctuate without explanation, it makes everything, every element of society, that much harder to interpret and understand. As another example, let's look at Tatooine. The way Luke Skywalker described it, I really felt like I could make some reasonable assumptions about the nature of the galaxy from his feelings about his home planet alone. Tatooine was a remote world, far from anything important. A place so removed from the centers of power in the galaxy that it was easy to ignore the growing injustices and abuses within them. He might not have liked the Empire, but all the Empire really was to him was a few stormtroopers and maybe a Star Destroyer making a stop every few years or so as part of some scheduled patrol. He had no idea what life was like in the core, where Imperial power was at its zenith because news was slow to reach him, and when it did, it was likely distorted to the point where who knew what to believe. Life on Tatooine was slow, with change even slower. If something broke, you might not always be able to easily replace it. To survive, you'd need to get by on your own repairs, and maybe not pay too much attention to where your second-hand droids came from. Maybe, every once in a while, a new shipment from the core would arrive, but it would sell fast, because who knew when the next transport would get there? Might be months, or even years. The galaxy was a big place, far too big to ever see more than a fraction of it. Tatooine might as well have been completely alone, cut off from the rest of the universe. But the more I see of how hyperspace travel works in this galaxy, the less my initial interpretation makes sense. In the span of just a couple days, Obi-Wan Kenobi can travel to Coruscant from Utapau, then to Mustafar, and finally to Polis Massa. And those weren't solely travel days. He was up to quite a bit, and it seems like only a few hours were actually spent in hyperspace. An entire Rebel fleet, carriers and fighters alike, can go from Yavin to Scarif, a distance covering a significant part of the galaxy, pretty much instantaneously. While these events and others might all have various mitigating circumstances, better classes of hyperdrive, favorable routes, whatever it might be, I still think there's enough evidence to say pretty definitively that at the very least, space travel is pretty fast. The galaxy is small, at least in terms of travel time. You can go from one end to the other without too much effort. Going back to what Luke said, we now need to interpret this a bit differently. Tatooine is remote, but this has less to do with its physical distance from the core worlds and more to do with the greater variety of factors. It's poor in resources, not a great tourist destination, and for most people, there's simply no reason to go there. There's still regular communication and travel to places like Coruscant. Tatooine is pretty firmly integrated into the wider galaxy, but moisture farmers just don't have the desire or money to stay that informed or take a trip. When Luke speaks of the isolation he feels, it's more metaphorical. He could hop on a space bus and be in Coruscant that same day, but it's his obligations that prevent him from doing so. Now, I'm not saying that one interpretation is better than the other, nor is this a question of which one is more realistic. There are arguments for both. But what this does decide is the character of the universe. How big it might feel to the average person or how small, and to what degree, if any, reality reflects those feelings. It decides the pace at which ideas and news can be exchanged, the factors influencing economic development, social and cultural interactions, and the ease of political integration. And if we keep on going with the conclusion that hyperdrive is pretty fast, bordering on instantaneous, the character of the universe starts to feel a little incoherent. All these little details feel more and more out of sync. In a galaxy where travel from any planet to any other planet seems easy enough, what's the point of hyperspace routes? Is travel within them faster, safer, or just more profitable? Why are so many interstellar navies bothering with enormous starfighter carriers when an X-Wing operating from a dirt runway has essentially the same range? And what's responsible for the Outer Rim's lack of development after millennia of interstellar civilization? Why is there this sudden drop in the level of development if it's not based on physical distance? What other factors contributed to this? The main problem with hyperspace travel ultimately comes down to the fact that there is no coherent or consistent explanation to how it works. With a lot of things, that might not matter too much, or their influence on the wider galaxy won't be too profound. But when you're trying to answer the question, how long does it take to get to X from Y, the answer, it's not really important, don't worry about it, isn't a great answer at all, because it is important. It's one of the most fundamental aspects that shapes the entire structure and character of the galaxy. Of course, it should be at least acknowledged that this universe is not the only one to suffer from this problem. The time it took Bilbo Baggins to reach Rivendell seems quite a bit different from that of Frodo. And while the United Federation of Planets is described as a vast entity that can take a starship years to cross, sometimes it can feel quite a bit smaller than that. But we need to make a clear distinction between these two examples and the use of hyperdrive. Whether you're crossing Middle-earth or the Federation, we have a pretty solid baseline of how long that should take. We know roughly how fast a horse can move, or how many times the speed of light warp 7 is. There might be detailed explanations going into all the nitty-gritty details, but even these rough estimates are more than enough to understand how and why these places function as they do. When the rules are broken, when Númenórean cavalry crosses 1,800 miles of ocean and 300 miles of forest in a couple nights, or when all of Starfleet can quickly show up in one place, it doesn't feel very plausible. But with hyperspace travel, we're in the opposite position. Most of the time, its rules are ignored. There is no baseline. It might as well be a magic spell used to solve a problem. And ironically, in this case, it's when the rules are followed that you have the problem. In nearly every instance, the concept of hyperdrive fuel doesn't seem to be a big consideration to most people. So when a shortage of fuel is about to doom the Resistance, it feels out of place, like it came out of nowhere. Hyperspace travel has gone from this magic solution to something with limitations, and its rules are now at the forefront. Is it missing the point then to start asking questions like, why doesn't the First Order jump another ship in front of the Resistance to cut off their escape? Or why doesn't the Resistance send out a ship that has some fuel left to go to a gas station to pick up more and bring it back to the fleet? Once the door is open, once the mechanics of how hyperdrive works are portrayed not as a magic solution that can be ignored, but at the center of a problem with a clear solution, it's really hard to close that door and go back to it not mattering. Either everything related to it is important or none of it is. And if I had to choose between a universe where the rules are sometimes broken, or one where the rules are sometimes followed, I know which choice I'd make. But that, of course, is just my opinion. And even though I can move at the speed of truth, which is admittedly way slower than the speed of lies, I'd like to hear your thoughts. How long does it take you to get some ice cream from the local shop? Does hyperdrive's contradictory nature even bother you at all? Or are you just grateful that you don't need to enter a dimension of madness and demons to get where you're going? Let me know in the comments below, and until next time, this has been Incoming. In Incoming, the Templin Institute discusses the theories and ideas found across alternate worlds. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to join the Templin Institute, consider pledging to our Patreon page. Along with increased security access, you'll be able to vote in polls to determine future topics, get custom wallpaper every week, and receive some other exclusive rewards.